Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. My name is Arunima Krishna, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Communication. The work I'm presenting today actually complements the work that was discussed earlier happening at George Mason and at Yale about public concern about climate change, but takes a different lens to public perceptions of climate change. So in this study, I advance a typology of disinformation-susceptible publics about climate change, which is particularly important to understand given the amount of money that is spent on concerted efforts to cast doubt on climate science and its impact on health and our lives. So I used a variety of theoretical frameworks to develop this typology, including the data information knowledge wisdom framework, as well as the situational theory of problem solving. Next slide, please. The central postulate of my study is this. It is possible to segment people from the broader population into one of four climate change disinformation publics based on three variables: their knowledge deficiency or their past acceptance of disinformation, the valence and strength of their attitudes about climate change, and their situational motivation about climate change, or the extent to which they want to do something about climate change. So if you have data on these three variables, it is possible to identify those who are immune to disinformation, who are vulnerable to disinformation, who are receptive to disinformation, and who are most likely to amplify disinformation, or the four publics of disinformation susceptibility. I primarily use surveys in my research, so I was able to collect this information from about 650 Americans and classify them into one of these four publics. Next slide, please. So then the question is, how does one do the classification? It's actually pretty simple. I used a common public segmentation technique where I dichotomized each variable and classified each individual into a high or low category for each variable. So for example, if you reported, let's say 4.35 out of 5 on the climate change denial attitude scale, you would be reclassified as 1 or high on the extreme attitudes variable. And I can talk more about the method later on if anyone's interested. Next slide. So here's what the typology looks like. Based on one's scores on motivation, attitude, and knowledge, they can be classified into one of four disinformation susceptible publics. Those in the green zone are disinformation immune publics, or folks who don't have extreme negative attitudes about climate change and have not accepted disinformation about it either. They are unlikely to accept further disinformation about climate change in the future, and depending on their motivation, they may be climate action advocates. Then there are those in the disinformation vulnerable category. These are folks who are at medium risk of accepting disinformation, but may be willing to listen to pro-climate action messages and offset the negative effects of disinformation campaigns. Then in the red zone are disinformation receptive publics, or those who have accepted disinformation messages in the past and therefore are highly knowledge deficient and are high on one of the other two variables, either motivation or attitudes, but not both. Disinformation messages would likely conform with their currently held beliefs about climate change, and therefore they'd be likely to be resistant to correction efforts. Convincing these folks to reject disinformation messages will likely be an uphill task, but not necessarily an impossible one. And then finally, there are those who demonstrate high levels of motivation, knowledge deficiency, as well as highly extreme attitudes about climate change, whom I refer to as disinformation amplifying publics. Next slide, please. Now, as you can see from these numbers, the size of the disinformation amplifying publics from the sample is pretty small, but this is consistent across other issues as well, including anti-vaccine activism. But these folks are those who tend to have the loudest voices and the most outsized voice in the debate about climate change and are motivated to spread false information about climate change to others. So it is important to understand them. I do have additional analyses about these folks' political ideology, which I'm happy to share with you, but I'll stop here for now, and thank you for having me.